Okay, so in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk more specifically about aspects of class and how they play out in the hospitality industry, and particularly in the work I'm talking about here in the area of the inner north of Melbourne, where we did research quite a bit. So what I want to kind of talk about here is the way that kind of class is both a structural position, that is, how much money you've got, the job you have, the things you own, all that kind of economic stuff. But what we're talking about here is the more cultural and symbolic aspects of class, and how, while they kind of do map onto the economic, the lines between these things are more blurry. And the way the kind of class is made in everyday moments, that is the way kind of class is felt, the way that people make judgments about each other. This kind of plays out in everyday moments. And it does so differently within different institutions. So in the hospitality industry, I'm going to talk about examples of how that works. So this is particularly expressed in the ways that venues try and set up a particular vibe that we've discussed already. And we can kind of see how that maps onto particular tastes, which relate to kind of different positions of class. But it also kind of relates to the workers themselves, how they feel in the venue, and how they then relate to the punters and the customers in the venue, particularly when it comes to dealing with what they always tend to call dickheads, people, that are drunk, people that are causing problems, judging who's going to be a problem. So class kind of emerges relationally in these moments, but it's kind of complex, doesn't necessarily completely map onto economics. So this kind of happens symbolically through effects, through the way that people relate emotionally to each other. Sometimes the workers are reflexive about this and feel bad about it. Sometimes they have an ironic attitude towards these kind of things. But pretty much every moment of being a bar worker, you need to kind of make judgments about how people are behaving, what they're doing, whether they're going to be a risk or a problem. And the only way you can really do this, I suppose, is through your own socialization in terms of your orientation towards the world and other people. And therefore that relies on your own formation of stereotypes and your own kind of taste hierarchies and morals. This tends to then play out through class markers and symbols. So importantly here, class isn't just a static position. People are moving through their lives and may be from a particular class background or may have a particular class identity. But when you move through the world, you're in different positions, in different places where it feels like it's more upper class or lower class or whatever. So your orientation towards the world and the way you feel is affected by that relationality. This also relates to the different forms of labour we've been talking about here, effective labour, material labour. Young people's very presence in these places is valuable. Their tastes, their kind of sexy, edgy, cool kind of stuff going on that relates to young people's value. And so, again, this relates to different kinds of class and taste hierarchies. Venues tend to be going for a specific aesthetic, again, that maps onto these kind of hierarchies and taste as well. So the participants we're talking about here came from a range of backgrounds. We can't really say they were all middle class or all working class. Some of them grew up in Melbourne, some came from outside Melbourne and from rural backgrounds or suburban backgrounds. But the class here is more about that relationality. Class here is about positionality, not static position. And it comes to the performative aspects that then play out as your role as a hospitality worker. So as I said, young people bring a particular forms of cultural and subcultural capital to the job, what you know, what you like, your tastes, and this is important to the vibe of the bar. But many of the bar workers at the same time are working in hospo on a trajectory to something else. It's kind of a job to have while you build your career, while studying or whatever. And as we spoke about before, another way the class plays out here is that some young people kind of get almost trapped in the industry because of various lack of opportunity and lack of capitals and can't get out. So how this plays out, I'm going to kind of talk about some specific examples of how class works in these kind of banal everyday moments. Firstly, a very obvious one that kind of tracks onto the economic side of class is that many of our workers described that they couldn't afford to eat in the venues that they were working in, particularly more kind of bohemian joints or more fine dining places. And it wasn't always, though, about whether you could afford it or not. Experienced hospitality workers in particular would point out that they're just too overpriced for the stuff that you get. They're so overpriced, it's not worth $200 a head. Sydney had eaten in this venue before, and she didn't even enjoy the food. She's not the right demographic for it. So this is an example of someone working in a venue that's not necessarily to her own tastes and was making some kind of judgments about it. As Rollo points out here, he just kind of basically points out that he's a student and couldn't afford to eat in the cafe that he was working in. Couldn't afford to eat the $23 classic Eggs Benedict. It was just beyond his means. So again, you can see the economic aspects of that playing out, not necessarily taste. Farana talks about kind of more cultural aspects. She'd prefer to kind of, make sandwiches and sit on the beach with her friends rather than pay the overpriced cost of eating in her venue. So when it comes to money, material aspects are certainly important. Some people can afford it or not, but it's not necessarily all about affording as well. Sometimes it then relates to kind of one's taste and their kind of orientations towards the food itself or the drinks. What was spoken about before is that kind of venues that are trying to create a particular vibe are advantaged if they have people in the venue that align to what the bar is going for. And this creates kind of a good vibe and a good kind of form of conviviality, and it kind of resonates with the aesthetic that they're going for. So young people have different imperatives in terms of why they want to work in a particular place. We'll relate this to Bourdieu's idea of illusio, the way that people invest themselves into certain practices. And obviously there's the financial imperative, you need a job to pay your rent, to eat. But people then kind of want to work in venues as best they can that kind of suits their own consumption tastes. And when this happens, things tend to work well and the job feels better. This is particularly the case when you can kind of enact your politics or even your consumption practices through the work. So particularly in the inner north in Melbourne, there was examples of young people working in bars that kind of allowed them to express their politics, particularly around identity and sexuality and issues of feminism, like Jenny's pointing out here, that they have an LGBTI night and they can kind of feel good about enforcing the respectability and safety that comes with that night. Kind of resonates with Jenny's own politics. Others talk about, in particularly when there's live music in the venue, their own tastes of kind of resonating that. Working in hospo, many musicians and artists, this guy's talking here, like most of them are going to have worked in hospitality as well. So there's this kind of convolution of tastes and needs coming together in that space. But the vibe there is kind of relates to illusio. People are investing various aspects of themselves into the job. And it works well when it comes to collusio, a kind of collusion between different needs and wants and desires. But what's interesting about this kind of investment of politics in work and the ability to express it or experience it at work is that things can come into conflict. The inner north is quite a progressive area of Melbourne, but it's also being heavily gentrified. And these kind of tensions come into play. And our participants felt this. So the inner north is also, an artistic kind of space, lots of live music, lots of art scene stuff goes on there. So these kind of forces can come into tension. Forces of gentrification are great here. They've been going on for decades, where the original kind of inhabitants are kind of being moved out and pushed out because of the rising rents and rising cost of the housing. So young people want to move to these areas for the good stuff that's going on, the nightlife, the art stuff, the music. It's close to the universities, but struggle to afford to live there themselves and often have to live in share houses, 6 in them or whatever. But kind of working in the venues around this space is homologous to their own tastes. So there's good stuff going on, but they also can then, from the venue, witness some of the kind of practices that they don't like, and particularly with gentrification. So as Karen talks about here, her venue kind of actively doesn't want to bring certain types of people in. What she's talking about there are the kind of poor people that still live in the social housing around the place. And it sounds awful because it's freezing people out, and she feels gross about that. She's not in denial of it. It's part of gentrification. It sucks that dudes that have been drinking in this place for 30 years are being squeezed out. It makes her feel uncomfortable, but also she totally sees why this is the case. And this relates, I think, to some of the reflexive complicity stuff that we were talking about when it comes to punk. People kind of know about this dodgy stuff that's going on, feel that they can't do much about it, just kind of get on with things. So what happens in these spaces too is workers have to regulate what goes on in the space. And this can be good when it's people like you. So if you're in a place that you're into indie music and that's what's played in the venue, and people that like indie music are coming to the venue, you feel at home. One of our respondents kind of talked about how it felt like a lounge room. You can be yourself. It's harder though when it becomes the kind of dealing with problems, and problems are generally more often than not young drunk men. And this is even harder again when the young drunk problems aren't kind of like you, if they're kind of, in your perception, lower or higher on the class scale, don't have your tastes, don't speak like you, and all that kind of stuff. So these kind of relations, the way that kind of problems are regulated, is often done through what are kind of fairly obvious class, gender, racial stereotypes. And the directionality of these go up and down. What's interesting is that our participants were kind of young university students quite often with kind of fairly left politics interests, progressive politics, and therefore they had a kind of political attitude towards the poor that was kind of empathetic and much less empathetic against the kind of people with more money than them. So when they talked about people having less class, it was often about people that were richer than them, behaving like dickheads, throwing around their credit card and just being sexist and that kind of stuff. The actual language of class came out more when it was talking about people that were behaving poorly, that had privilege, rather than those down them. As Greg eloquently points out here, we're talking about the Chrysler brand of dickhead as opposed to the Datsun brand of dickhead. So in this sense, bar workers are kind of like phenomenologists. They are kind of in their venue sensing what's going on, making kind of instinctive judgments, trying to almost short circuit any problems that may happen in the future. This is particularly the case later at night in venues without security, when it's left up to the bar staff to enforce this stuff. This is particularly a problematic thing when it comes to gender relations that we'll talk in more detail later in the course. Here we're talking about judgments about making a judgment about who's going to be a problem. And again, Greg here kind of points out how he makes judgments about who could be a problem. When someone walks in the bar, when they're passive, when they're at ease, you don't even really look at them. But straight afterwards, they could draw your attention because their shoulders are back and swaggering, kind of overtly masculine stuff, or they're hunched and furtive. He's looking for different kinds of body language. When I say looking here, it's not kind of deliberate. It just kind of becomes part of the job. You're just kind of doing it almost instinctively. These kind of poor aspects of body language are kind of indicators that the person is not there just to have a good time, particularly when you see them watching others and all this kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting quote, that, because what he's talking about, I think, maps onto some kind of class issues. He also, in the interview, talks about particular things about shoes, and sunglasses and hats, and these different kind of taste markers that relate to class as well. So dealing with dickheads, different brands of dickheads, and they use the term dickhead a lot. It was almost like an industry term to talk about people that are a problem. Sometimes it's about creating a safe space. No one's allowed to be a dick. You try and foster a sense of how to kind of do this in the space generally. So when people come in there, the effective atmosphere of the place encourages kind of conviviality and joy rather than kind of confrontation and stuff like that. A welcoming, safe space to be in. So there's a management and vibe going on there. But when it comes to more specifically, Greg again here talks about how he knows how to handle a drunk. And many participants talked about different methods of dealing with this. So here he's got a guy that's drunk. He's being aggressive. He was yelling nasty comments at his girlfriend, and she was trying to get him to leave, and he wasn't really paying attention. So Greg goes up to him, hides his glass behind him, and says, "Oh, look, it's empty. That guy, it's gone now. That beer. Maybe you can come up here and have a kind of glass of water, and you can kind of get over it." And kind of pacifies him in this kind of non-confrontational way. As we'll see later in the course, quite often in this situation, women are sent to kind of defuse any violent situation under the misnomer, really, that a man won't hit a woman in public space. And so we'll talk about in that some detail later in the course. So there we're talking about kind of, dealing with drunks, and particularly in that example, dealing with kind of people lower on the class scale. We also have some kind of, as I said, examples of our participants having to deal with drunks kind of higher in the class scale. Silver service, where, someone, you're expected to kind of put a napkin on the crutch and the guy's being sleazy and all that kind of stuff. So in these kind of situations, our respondents kind of know that they're kind of below these people economically in the class system, but feel above them culturally and morally because they don't behave in those kind of sexist ways. Karen here has a kind of way that she talks about an everyday moment of kind of dealing with this kind of stuff, this kind of cure them with kindness kind of way. Kind of shames people into being nice. I'm so incredibly sorry that you're finding this so hard. They particularly talked about situations of serving lunches or dinners with big groups of men from businesses with credit cards, where there's kind of the dude at the head of the table that's paying for everything and they're all kind of worshipping him. And he's the one kind of showing off, and all the younger kind of men are kind of acting up and kind of trying to impress that guy, and how difficult those situations can be when you're a female waitress in that situation. And our participants had different methods to deal with these things. Again, we'll go into those in more detail next week. So in terms of class and how these kind of moments make class in everyday situations, it's about the way that people make judgments about each other, relate to each other, and how, therefore, in those situations, people feel. And these kind of things, therefore, emerge through acts of symbolic violence in particular. The way that judgments are made, through tastes and morals, through markers of consumption, and things like that. The forms of labour are important here. This is what's being mined to create value. And young people themselves kind of aren't oblivious to these things. They're reflexive about what's going on, but kind of can be complicit in these processes as well. So aesthetics and the senses matter in these kind of situations. They're not kind of in some kind of vacuum. They happen within a set of norms and structures that relate to class position, and in terms of gender and race and other forms of inequality as well, that we'll talk about in future parts. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.